The show will be starting in 5 minutes. If you would like to use the bathroom or get any water or beverages, please do so now. There are no intermissions in the show. The show will be starting in 5 minutes. Please feel free to use the bathroom or get any drinks and soda now. There are no intermissions in the show. The show will be starting momentarily. Please find your seats. The show will be starting momentarily. Please find your seats.
From Kenya to Colombia, from Iraq to Korea,
Kenya to Colombia,
from
schools,
Iraq
in
to
prisons,
Korea,
and in theaters.
slums,
Every day,
schools,
people gather
in
at
prisons,
TEDx events
and in
around the
theaters.
world to hear the
Every
best
day,
ideas
people
bubbling
gather
up
at TEDx
in their
events around the
communities.
world to hear the best ideas bubbling up in their communities.
You are part of a global conversation about
Today,
our shared future.
you are part of a global conversation about our shared future. So what is this TEDx? TEDx is an initiative of the TED Conference, a nonprofit devoted to ideas worth spreading. We grant free licenses to allow TED-like events to spread globally. This event today is based on the TED Conference format and ideals, but is independently organized by your local community. So please make sure to thank the team of volunteers who worked so hard on today's event. It's their ideas, dedication, and time that made it all possible. It's they who booked all the speakers, and the views you'll hear today are, of course, those of those speakers, not necessarily of TEDs. But we hope their talks spark an exciting conversation among you. This is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for openness and for critical thinking, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you'll take out. And now, on with the show.
Welcome, everyone, to the third annual TEDx Poncey Highland show. We are so excited and truly grateful that we're able to gather today in person. The last year and a half have probably not been what a lot of us expected it to be. But as the country and the world improves our policies and our precautions and gets people back to living a normal, regular, and fulfilling life, we're able to have shows like this courtesy of TED Global and our great team. Before we get started, I do want to give a shout out to our sponsors. First off, the Plaza Theater, who have been here for over 75 years and are the only independent theater in the entire state of Georgia. Let's give them a round of applause. Second, I'd like to give a shout out to our truly incredible superhero film and production team at Atlanta Video. They have done everything from help us set up lighting, to the camera crew that you see all around us, the folks who are doing the PowerPoint presentations, and everything in between. And they have been such willing and truly incredible partners. So let's give them a quick round of applause. And then our last two sponsors, Chromalog Photography, was led by Danish Thorani, standing stage right, and his team, as well as One Stripe Chai, a locally founded masala chai Indian tea company based in Portland, Oregon, with roots here in Georgia and northern India. So the theme of this year is building blocks. And what does that mean? So for the last 18 months, what we've seen is an unfortunate exacerbation of a lot of the inequalities and inequities that plague not only our nation, but our entire planet. And what we're hoping is that having this wide open understanding of the different difficulties that not only each one of us face, our families might face, but our communities and those across the world are facing, will inspire each one of us, our neighbors, those in our schools and our workplaces, to take an extra step forward to help each other and to lend an additional hand. And so our speakers today will be speaking about economic security, healthcare, and the use of language when we discuss topics related to race. And so with that being said, I'd like to introduce one of my co-organizers, Dana Boskowitz.
Hi everyone, my name is Dana Boskowitz. I'm on the TEDx Poncey Highland team. I serve as our Director of Marketing and Social Media. So just a few housekeeping items for you. We do ask that you silence your cell phones during the show today to have the best experience and to respect our speakers. I know it can be hard. We want to show what we're doing on social media. I get that. So just turn your flash off if you do take a photo, and most importantly, do not forget to tag us. We are TEDx Poncey Highland on Instagram, or use the hashtag TEDx PoHi. Thank you. And so like Ali said, the past year and a half has been really hard, and it feels surreal to be standing here with all of you in this theater. A year and a half ago, this just wasn't possible. And so what a more fitting way to kick off our event than to hear from an expert in pandemic preparedness. She is a scientist, a doctor, a lecturer, a legislator. There is truly not a hat that she cannot wear, and wear it very well. So without further ado, please welcome Jasmine Clark, Representative Dr. Jasmine Clark, to the stage.
So then we had the 1918 flu, also referred to the Spanish flu at the time. This was a respiratory pathogen that spread by inhaling and exhaling, just like the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we found was that, sorry, hold on, I got to regroup. And what we found is that the mitigation efforts that we're using today were the same ones that we used back then. Things like masks and social distancing and having to close businesses. So we have all these examples of outbreaks as far back as 1918. So if we have this, then why then did it feel like this time we weren't very prepared for this pandemic? And what can we do to be better prepared in the future? When considering the next pandemic, we must take into account the pathogen, the people, the price, and public health. So let's start with the pathogen. There are many different types of pathogens out there, such as bacteria, like what we saw in the 14th century with the plague in Europe. We also have viruses like influenza and coronavirus. And when we are making a preparedness plan for the next pandemic, we must take into account the type of pathogen that we're dealing with, as well as how that pathogen spreads and how it is treated. So, for example, for bacterial microbes, they are usually going to spread by either by bodily fluids like saliva or blood, or sometimes they can spread by animal or bug bites. But bacteria is pretty treatable right now. We have antibiotics, and unless we're dealing with a pathogen that has antibiotic resistance, then in that case, we will have to consider some other things in our preparedness plan. Viruses, however, are a little different. Many viruses require humans for a majority of their life cycle. And basically the way they work is they hijack your body and use your body in order to survive and spread. So they need you. And while this type of, and so during this pandemic and in previous pandemics, the way that respiratory viruses like coronavirus spread is through the inhaling and exhaling of the virus. And so we have things like respiratory droplet transmission, which is going to involve these larger moisture droplets, the ones that we exhale all the time. They're pretty heavy, so they don't linger in the air. They fall to the ground pretty quickly. And so because of that, things like social distancing work okay for that. But there's also airborne transmission. And with airborne transmission, these are going to involve much lighter and smaller droplets that have the ability to float through the air, and therefore they're able to spread much further. And so the criteria for stopping the spread of that type of pathogen is going to have to be much more stringent, such as using special masks or isolation and quarantine. But regardless if we're talking about respiratory droplets or aerosols and airborne transmission, the truth is we all have to breathe, right? So that makes this type of spread extremely effective in a pandemic. And so as we prepare for the next pandemic, again, it's going to be very important that we have different types of plans for the different types of pathogens that we may encounter. So now that we've dealt with the pathogen, let's talk about the people. So it may seem like dealing with a pathogen is going to be complicated, but look, it's not nearly as complex as dealing with humans. So when it comes to the human response, we live in the United States where freedoms are the bedrock of society. So there are going to be a number of different responses to a threat like a pandemic pathogen. So for some, they await the information from the health organizations, and they will do whatever it takes to get past the pandemic. Others are a little more skeptical. They're resistant to mitigation efforts. They are distrustful of health organizations or distrustful of the government itself. And some of them may not even believe that there even is a pandemic. Believe it or not, we have examples of this as far back as 1918, when we saw things like the Anti-Mask League in San Francisco, which led efforts against mask wearing, claiming that they were a hassle and probably unconstitutional. Sound familiar? And while in 1918, they did not have the ability to share a meme or make something go viral, pun intended, the way that we do now, we have to think about this. At the rate that information spreads today, it is unfathomable how quickly it will spread when in the future pandemic. So our preparedness plan needs to recognize that there will be people who are going to be resistant to mitigation and treatment efforts, and we need to plan for that. This will require clear communication of reliable information from trusted, that's important, trusted sources. The information campaign must be more robust than the inevitable disinformation or misinformation campaigns. So best practices when dealing with a public health crisis involve things like accepting and involving all the stakeholders in the process, being honest and open with people, listening to people, collaborating with other credible sources, meeting the needs of the media so that they can get good information out to the public, communicating clearly and compassionately, and also planning carefully and thoroughly. So after we deal with the people, we must also consider the price. How do we handle the inevitable economic implications of our response? As we know, closing businesses is expensive, but it is often necessary to stop the spread of a pathogen during a pandemic. Therefore, our plan needs to account for ways to keep businesses afloat. This will involve things like financially supporting businesses that must close, and also financially supporting those employees that find themselves without work through no fault of their own, or those who must leave the workforce due to things like lack of child care. So during this pandemic, I would say we did an okay job with this, but there was certainly room for improvement. Such as, how do we handle unemployment when large numbers of people are going to be seeking assistance all at once? And how do we make sure that our smaller businesses and our self-employed have equitable access to resources? We must also ensure that our plan supports alternative work solutions like working from home, and maybe investing in an online infrastructure that makes it easy for businesses to switch to an online business model pretty easily with very little disruption. We can also help businesses shift their products, such as what we saw during this pandemic, where distilleries started making hand sanitizer. And the making and selling of masks was actually very important for stopping the spread of the pathogen. But some businesses must remain open, and their employees do not have the luxury of working from home. This is who we refer to as the essential worker. And if we're going to call them essential workers, then we must treat them as essential. Their wages should reflect their importance as drivers of the economy during the pandemic. And it is very important that we protect them from getting sick. We need to limit their exposure to the pathogen, and they should be first in line for mitigation resources like masks and treatments like vaccines. Basically, if they are essential the way we say they are, we need to treat them as such and not treat them as expendable. So right now, next slide. So now let's move on to public health. What does public health mean in a country that celebrates individualism? Public health takes into account that healthy communities actually lead to better outcomes for the individual. But when you're dealing with a pandemic, the pathogen is not an individual risk, but is a public risk. And it will require community-based strategies in order to stop. Look, I know y'all are all really important people, but the virus does not care about your status in society. It does not care who you are. Look, the virus just wants your body, anybody. And so that our plan needs to reflect that reality. Right now, we have a health inequity problem in our society that we must address. And we must address those inequities during the good times. As the saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Therefore, we must prioritize health equity and access to resources, care, and testing. Right now, the overlap between those who lack access to health care and the essential worker is actually very counterproductive to stopping the spread of a pathogen during a pandemic. So hear me out. Right now, only 24% of low-wage workers, who coincidentally end up being many of your essential workers during a pandemic, actually have access to employer-provided health insurance. And if they were to get sick, only about half of those low-wage workers have access to paid leave. And even that pay may not be their full pay, making them more likely to have to rely on borrowing money or seeking government assistance in order to make up for lost wages. And the truth of the matter is, if a person cannot afford or does not have the ability to stay home when they are sick, guess what? They go to work and they risk exposing others, which is not how you stop a pandemic. So our preparedness plan must, absolutely must, protect workers from getting sick and protect their livelihood if they do get sick. So I started this talk out with a question. When the next pandemic happens, will we be prepared? The answer to this question will involve a holistic preparedness plan that gives appropriate weight to the pathogen, the people, the price, and public health. We do not have to repeat the mistakes of the past. We have the option to learn from those mistakes and to use them as our guide to do better for everyone in the future. Thank you.
right. Thank you, Dr. Clark. Can we give another round of applause for Representative Dr. Clark? Thank you for your fantastic talk. Okay, hi everyone. Just to introduce myself, I'm Jen. I'm the other co-founder of TEDx Poncey Highland. I'm thrilled you're all here and that we're at Plaza again this year. Thrilled to have Dr. Clark here too.
Thank you.
So I am also starting as a resident physician at Emory this year, or this week actually.
Oh, wow.
Thanks. So, Dr. Clark, what you touched on at the end of your talk, especially about addressing healthcare inequities, especially in access to resources and the discrepancy in the essential worker population, that resonated really deeply with me as someone who works in the healthcare field and sees those issues consistently firsthand in patients. So, as we try to move forward from the current pandemic and from a legislative point of view for you, what do you think are the most important aspects of healthcare inequities that can most realistically be addressed? And I guess the second part of that question is, what can we as a general population do to become further involved and help those issues?
So that's a really good question, and one that I think we have the answers to. We just need the political will to do it. We need to make sure that everyone has access to care. And that means ensuring that we do not exhaust any options when it comes to making sure that people can go to the doctor and can afford to go to the doctor and are not afraid to go to the doctor. These are going to be important things. What we saw during this pandemic is exactly what I said at the end. There were people who knew they had symptoms or felt sick, but they did not have the option to stay home. You know why? Because they still needed to pay their rent. They still needed to pay their bills. And they did not have access to things like paid leave, so they could actually make the choice to stay home, get better, and not potentially spread the virus to other people. And so when we talk about things like policy that makes sure everyone has insurance, or if we even go a stretch further and talk about universal access to health care, these are important things that we will need to have in the future in order to stop pandemics much faster than what we did this time around.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I guess my follow-up question, or the second part of that, is what can we, out in the audience, what can I, as lay people who may not really be as familiar with the legislative side of things, what can we do to be involved?
So you are always, always, always welcome to reach out to your legislators, to reach out to whomever is making the decisions that are affecting your life, and let them know what is important to you. It's really important that the lawmakers know that when they are voted into their positions, that they are voted by the people, and so therefore they need to be doing the things that the people want them to do and need them to do. So if you need health care, if you need that hospital in your area to not close, if you need to talk about things like paid leave, those are things that you can go directly to your congressperson or your state legislator, and even sometimes down to the county and city level, and actually speak directly to the people that you vote into office about.
Awesome. And I liked what you said earlier about how people may have like a mistrust of the healthcare system, may be hesitant to go to the doctor. Even with the vaccines, the COVID vaccines recently, we've seen in Georgia that the percentages are fairly low in certain places because of historical context with certain populations and the history that we've had. So what do you propose in how we engage folks who may be hesitant or have a justifiable mistrust in the healthcare system or the systems that are disseminating information?
So that's a really good question. During this pandemic, one of the things that we didn't do that was on my list of best practices is the clear communication. So there was so much information floating around that people didn't really know where to find the good information, or they didn't know what to hold on to. So what they did was they held on to the things that made the most sense to them, or the things that they saw the most. And so what ends up happening is if someone already didn't trust something, they're just going to go to other people and seek information from others that don't trust the same things they don't trust. So we actually need voices in our community that are those trusted voices to give people honest information about what's going on, to speak to people at a level where they understand what's going on, what we're trying to do, and not talk at people, talk to people about the importance of things like vaccines and mask wearing and all these other things. But you're right, there is a distrust out there. Historically, I talked a lot about history today. Historically, there are certain groups of people that have, justifiable reason to mistrust the information that's coming out there. And so we, again, have to kind of break down those walls by using those trusted sources and communicating things to where people can understand why it's so important for them to seek treatment and vaccines.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll take that too. Thank you, Dr. Clark. All right. Okay. I also have the privilege of welcoming our next speaker. So as someone who grew up in the diaspora with firsthand experience struggling to learn how to take agency over how I define my own racial identity in different personal and professional spaces, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Erica Hall, who is a professor at Emory's Goizeta Business School, and who will push us to reconsider the effect of how we place these labels on others. So without further ado, Dr. Erica Hall.
Thank you. Thank you. When you look, yes, absolutely. Can you hear me? Yes. Loud and clear. Awesome. When you look at me, how would you describe me? Keep it coming. A black woman, an African American woman. Well, these two descriptors use racial labels, and the available labels used to describe each race are growing every day. So if you wanted to use a racial label to describe me, you could use the term black, African American, BIPOC, person of color, as well as a variety of other racial labels that, frankly, I probably wouldn't appreciate as much. But if you're wondering, I prefer the label black. Why? Well, I appreciate the unity and solidarity of being part of a group that doesn't have to be hyphenated. I love the sheer beauty in the fact that the melanin in my skin connects me deeply with millions of people around the globe. And my blackness actually fuels a lot of my personal and professional life, where professionally, I built my career as a professor by researching race and racial biases. And personally, I chose to live in Atlanta because I wanted my black children to see themselves in a sea of other black professionals and entrepreneurs. Sentimentally, my blackness is associated with a host of memories, food, music, linguistics that I just want to mix up in a concoction like a Sunday dinner and just let my sweet, precious babies consume. So you can imagine that it came as a bit of a shocker that my 4-year-old daughter indignantly argued with me that her little brother was white. There I am, sitting there with this sweet little 6-month-old baby on my lap. She comes over to him, tickles him, and says, "Hi, my little white brother." Now, I told her he's not white, he's black, just like you, your mommy, and your daddy. And she looks at me, she argues back with me, pops her hip, and says, "Have you seen him in the sun?" 4-year-olds. Now, as his mother, I think I have the distinct authority of being the only one who can 100% attest to the fact that my son is 100% black, albeit a lighter-skinned black person than his sister. But my intelligent and precocious 4-year-old daughter had the perfect response. She reasoned that she'd pick a lighter colored crayon for him than she would pick for the rest of us. Now, this actually reminds me of when I was her age, and I had a similar memory where I would tell my cousins, I'm not black, I'm brown, see? And what these precious childlike experiences have in common is a tendency to treat racial labels as identifiers of color. But time and my own research have shown me that racial labels are so much more. Racial labels are even more than my phenotype. So more than the breadth of my nose, the width of my lips, the texture of my hair, racial labels are saturated with socially constructed imagery of what type of black person you think I am and what you think I stand for. Now, I started to know the power and complexity of racial labels when I started attending these networking events where I'd be talking with a white counterpart, and as I'm referring to myself as a black person, they would respond to me by referring to me as an African American. It was almost as if they were switching out the labels so not to offend me. And let's get these technical aspects correct. I mean, black is more of a global term, whereas African American refers solely to a resident of the United States. But colloquially, within this country, we use these two terms interchangeably. So I certainly wasn't offended by the use of either one, but I did find my counterpart's behavior to be a bit surprising. And I wondered whether to white Americans, the black label had some sort of stigma that I was missing. So the researcher in me set out to determine whether white Americans perceived black people differently than African Americans. So in a set of studies that I conducted with Catherine Phillips, Sarah Townsend, and James Carter, we created these fictitious application forms for a managerial position. And we created two versions that were identical, except for on one version, the person was identified as a black person, and on the other version, the person was identified as an African American person. The results floored me. We found that white Americans believed that the African American candidate was more than twice as likely to be in a managerial position. In the African American candidate, they saw a more educated and competent candidate, one that was worthy of a higher salary. So as I was thinking back to my networking party interactions, I realized that for my counterpart, the black label conjured up all these negative stereotypes, and they were reticent to apply those stereotypes to me. So at this point, I'm fascinated. I had to dig even deeper, try to figure out how racial labels become imbued with stereotypical content. And to do so, I had to go back in time. So let's take the label Negro. Most people will consider it negative or at least outdated. In fact, the label Negro was scrapped after the 2010 census because they kept getting complaints that it was old-fashioned and reminiscent of the Jim Crow era. And I started to realize that this racial label was evocative of the historical period that it gained prominence within. So Negro was frequently used to further Jim Crow ideology. Thus, it's not terribly surprising that it absorbed some of this ideology, and the subtle undertones of Jim Crow stick with it even to today. Now, this process of a term absorbing the meaning from the words that surround it is called semantic prosody. And a word gains semantic prosody when it soaks up the positive and negative tone of the words that immediately precede or follow it in natural language. So I'm going to give you an example of two sentences, one of which is perceived to be more negative, and you tell me which one that is. So the first is, the drug produced increased blood circulation in the extremities. The second one is, the drug caused increased blood circulation in the extremities. Now, between the first, produced, and cause, which one do you think is more negative? Show of hands for the first one. Okay, the second one? Absolutely. And this happens despite the fact that produced and cause are technically synonyms with the same definition in the dictionary. This is because cause has semantic prosody. It's frequently followed by words like death, problems, deceit, and produced is typically followed by more neutral words in natural language and conversation. Thus, the term cause has absorbed the meaning of these frequently negative words that follow it, and this meaning is retained even when those words are no longer present. So, if we think back to this idea of Negro absorbing this ideology of the Jim Crow era, it was absorbing the time that it was placed in, the historical time. And if we start to understand the historical era that birthed African American and Black, we can begin to understand their stereotypical undertones. So here's a history primer. So first, the term African American was birthed in 1988 when Reverend Jesse Jackson came out in a speech and said that Americans of African descent want to be called African American. Now, Jesse Jackson was associated with the late civil rights movement after getting his start by working with Martin Luther King Jr. And the civil rights movement suggested that voting and political participation was the correct means for achieving racial equality. Now, conversely, the Black label rose to prominence within the Black Power movement. When people like Stokely Carmichael, who later identified as Kwame Ture, championed its use. Now, the Black Power movement suggested that white supremacy had economically disadvantaged Black people, leaving them destitute, racially victimized, and subject to lower socioeconomic conditions. Now, if we turn back to this idea of semantic prosody, these racial labels absorb the content of the surrounding words that were used in their historical era. And we actually scientifically test this, right? So we analyzed 40 years worth of op-eds that were in major US newspapers that had the presence of African American or Black. And when the term African American was noted, the surrounding words were more reminiscent of civil rights and equality ideology. But when the Black label was listed, then those surrounding terms were more reminiscent of the Black Power movement. And this isn't just a historical curiosity, this actually has some tangible consequences. So in another study that we had two nonprofits that were committed to racial equality, only we varied the racial label on the nonprofit's name. So one was labeled the African American Alliance, and the other was labeled the Black Alliance. Now, when white Americans looked at the Black Alliance, they believed that that organization wanted to eradicate racial bias. They also believed that that organization felt that Malcolm X was their idol. And they believed the aim of that organization was to defund the police. For the African American Alliance, they believed that that organization wanted to champion civil rights and equality, that they also considered Martin Luther King Jr. their idol, and that finally they wanted to end voter suppression. So these encoded meanings actually factored into how much charity that they gave these organizations as well. We actually asked them to donate money, and that money we funneled to actual organizations. But when they were asked, what is most important to you, the white Americans who said, it's most important that we eradicate racial bias, were 99% more likely to donate to a Black alliance rather than an African American alliance. And those that said, no, I want to promote civil rights, were 50% less likely to donate to the Black Alliance than the African American Alliance. So I know that this is complex, right? And I want to highlight the complexity here. On one hand, the Black label is associated with racial victimization and poverty, so a Black applicant was considered to be less competent than an African American applicant. However, these same associations led people to then donate more money to a Black alliance because they thought that it would be better at furthering eradicating racial discrimination, right? So in all this complexity, I do want to leave you with 3 things that you can do to guide you to make more informed choices about which labels we choose for ourselves and others. The first thing that we can do is situate the label historically. Now, an interesting and fascinating way to do this is to use Google's Ngram Viewer, which charts the frequency of use of a term over time in a corpora of Google Books. So for example, let's take the term Latinx, which is a gender-neutral term used to describe descendants of Latin America. When was this term most frequently used? Well, we notice a large uptick in its use after 2010. What do we know about that period? Well, that period actually corresponds with a few pivotal dates for gender and sex identity issues. For example, the term Latinx started trending on Twitter after the 2016 shooting at Pulse nightclub, which was a gay bar frequented by the Latin American community. And so what can this tell us about the norms in society? Well, on one hand, Latinx is still a relatively less frequently used term than Hispanic, Latino, and Latina. And I think this might speak to the marginalization of non-binary people. However, on the other hand, the X in Latinx flows okay in English, but it sounds so awkward in Spanish. Latinx. And in Spanish is one of the predominant languages of the people that it professes to label. So the second thing that we can learn to do is to disaggregate. So typically, when we group people into a category, we tend to believe that the people within that category share more in common with each other than they do with people outside the category. So category labels can be broad. Think BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color, AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander, or Latinos. Or they could be more specific. So think Black, Pacific Islander, or Nicaraguan. Often the more specific label is more meaningful to a person, but this is dependent on context. So if I wanted to talk about the disadvantages faced by non-whites, then I could use BIPOC. That would be appropriate. However, oftentimes the struggles that are faced by a particular subgroup are different than the struggles faced by the broader group. So for example, the model minority stereotype is frequently associated with the AAPI community because of their relatively high median income. However, if we disaggregate out Pacific Islanders, we find that their median income is even lower than the US national average. So if we use the broad AAPI label, we would be blinded to the struggle that this individual group faces. Now, the third and final thing that you can do is to allow people to choose. And this one is the easiest because it takes the anxiety out of knowing which label to choose. Think back to my networking story, right? And it also allows people to be able to change the associations that they have with their racial label. So, for example, research by my doctoral advisor, Adam Galinsky, suggests that if you self-label with a derogatory label, you're able to dilute the negativity in that label, and you are more powerful to others. Okay? So all this talk about reappropriating a label may remind you of a certain label that thus far we've stayed clear of in this talk, and that is the N-word. So I can actually remember the first time that I was called the N-word. I was 23 and driving home from work when I cut another driver off at the stop sign. So I know you probably thought that story was going differently, but I am a horrible driver, okay? Anyway, the driver was irate. I had waved to make amends, and started driving back, and then I noticed in my rearview mirror that they spun around and started following me. So I went to the left, and I turned to the right, and they were still following me. So I began to get scared. No matter in what direction I went or how fast I went, they were still tailing me. So I drove all the way home, and I remember running to the front door, fumbling with my keys, trying to figure out what I'm going to do to avoid this physical attack. They come up to my driveway, they yell out, "Effing N-word," and then they just speed away. So although I was physically safe, the words fell coldly on my soul. In that moment, I felt stripped of my accomplishments, my dignity, my self-worth, and I felt transported back in time, back to, a 1940s whites-only pool club, back to an 1820s Georgia cotton field, back to the same anxieties that my ancestors must have felt chronically. And so I thought a lot about what I should do with that word. I can take it, I can label myself to take the power and the weight out of it, but the history in that word matters too much to me. And I can't find a point in history when that word wasn't used to utterly degrade and debase people that look like me. So to my white cocktail party counterparts, my networking counterparts, and to my thousands of research participants, they may think that black is a dirty word, but it doesn't even begin to compare to the N-word. The black label transports me to a point in time when the words that surrounded it signified dignity, beauty, and unity. Now, I'm an 80s baby, but it transports me back to the 60s and 70s with buy black signs and black is beautiful buttons. Back to the music of Otis Redding and Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell, music that nourishes my soul. And so if we think about the idea of semantic prosody, the words that follow the black label are only going to change when how we use it changes. Now, when black is used to describe professor and president and vice president, then it'll begin to absorb the associations with that frequently surrounding language. If you ask me, I am black without question. I'm going to pose a question to you that I'm going to ask my kids one day, which is, what do you want to be called? And what does that say about you? Thank you. Hey.
Let's give it up one more time for Dr. Hall. What I love so much about your speech, or your talk rather, is the economic implication of how folks choose to present themselves in personal and professional situations.
Yeah.
From your research, and even I'd be curious your own personal experience, how would you encourage folks who identify as Black, as African American, as other racial minority groups to identify themselves where they're both able to achieve a sense of economic security and be true to themselves and their own authenticity?
Gotcha. So I'm going to do a mix of research and personal anecdote with this one. So the first thing is, the tough thing with race research is you don't want to get into victim blaming, right? Or say that the onus is on Black people to present themselves in a certain way to not be ridiculed, right? So I try to steer clear of that, but I understand that it's also very much a concern. In terms of authenticity, I actually learned authenticity from my doctoral advisor, Catherine Phillips, who actually passed last year, but she was unapologetically authentic about her Blackness, and I just loved it. And I thought with a measure of success like hers, once I get my PhD, once I do this, then I'm going to be authentic with her, like her. And I think a lot of us think this, like once I have this measure of success, then I can present myself in whatever way that I want. Yeah, and there's a measure of truth to this, both from like a research aspect and a personal aspect. But the idea that if I achieve and I'm the greatest, then these other factors won't matter as much actually comes through in research as well. And that's one thing Kathy told me. She was like, if you're gonna do race research, you just gotta be the best, right? Then if they come for you, you have all the stats and the data on your side that you were absolutely the best at what you did. So yeah, I mean, it's typically within research we see this middle ground where there are mediocre accomplishments or we're not giving enough individuating information where we see the real bias persist. But the people that we see that are high achievers tend to mitigate this bias.
Okay, so you just spoke about like data and statistics.
Yeah.
And in the past year and a half, what we've seen is a lot of companies and nonprofits and other organizations have made such a huge push for diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, either scaling their programs up or starting new ones that they didn't have before. What advice do you have to those leaders, some of which are white, who are scaling these programs up on their own, to be more cognizant, and how should they use their the best racial language in order to remove bias, like your research shows, and center the experience on the applicant?
So I'm always in favor of having that conversation with the people that work with you, right? So how do they prefer? Then you can go forth and use the labels that they profess that they want to use, right? So that's number one that I think. But another thing that I think is that my research participants were white Americans from across the country, right? But they weren't HR professionals. So if there's one thing that we can do to fine-tune how we change these things, or to go to the HR professionals and train them specifically. Are they aware of these biases or how this might affect their mentality when they are choosing applicants? I'm not sure, right? But if we do go and do a targeted training of them, then I think we can help alleviate some of these consequences that are faced by the minority community.
Gotcha. And just to wrap up, what is next for your research? Is there more to this, or is there a part two?
Yeah, well, I am very into labels these days and also names. So I've done a few these things called audit studies where we send out application forms to actual job positions and see the rate of return that come back. And it's really affected by what somebody's name is, right? So I'm into studying names in general, but also other ethnic labels. Like I mentioned Latinx and some of the other developing labels that come about.
Awesome. Well, once again, let's give it up for Dr. Erica Hall. I get to have the distinct privilege and the special opportunity to be the speaker coach for our speakers. And in this experience, I get to learn about their stories, sometimes their upbringings, the work that they do, and what really drives them. And it's rare, being in my role, that you connect so deeply with one of the people that you get to work with. And so it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Hope Willen-Sack, who will be speaking about economic security and how we should reconsider the way we think about it. Ladies and gentlemen, Hope.
Test, on the mic.
One more time.
Test, mic check. 1, 2, 3. Hi, everyone.
Okay, let's use this one.
Okay, cool. Terrific. We're just going with the flow today. Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for being here. It's my distinct honor to talk to you all about guaranteed income today and economic insecurity, and I want to start with just a simple question. What do we think we know about why people are poor? What do we think we know about why people are facing insecurity? And I'm going to venture to say that most of what we think we know about why people are facing economic insecurity is wrong. And let me tell you why. Over the past year, I've worked with members of the Old Fourth Ward community and the broader Atlanta community in the Old Fourth Ward Economic Security Task Force. This is a coalition of 20 organizations, all looking into the root causes of economic insecurity. Basically, why are folks experiencing poverty and why at such rates and why for such prolonged periods of time, despite a lot of different interventions over decades. And during the course of this process, I got to talk to tons of different community members through surveys, listening groups, and community organizations. And this is where I met a woman named Tony. Tony was described to me some of her ambitions for her life, but also some of the challenges that she faced, and one of which was her daily commute to work. You see, Tony lives in the Old Fourth Ward, and I'm using Tony, that's not her real name, but Tony lives in the Old Fourth Ward, and every day she commutes to work in College Park. For those of you who aren't familiar with the area, that's about a 25-minute ride share away. And the reason I say ride share is Tony doesn't have a car. So she spends $50 every time she goes to work, commuting just to and from work. Tony knows that a car would be a launch pad for more opportunities for her, not just that job, but would give her access to other opportunities. But she doesn't quite know how to get that car. I watched as she meticulously brainstormed all of her options. She could get a loan for a car, but the interest rate for her would be very high, and she knew that was not a good idea for her long-term financial security. She also brainstormed ideas about working more. Even though she was making close to minimum wage, she could pick up more shifts, work more, and potentially be able to save enough money to buy a car. But Tony informed me that there's a strict asset limit in Georgia. So because she currently receives food stamps, or SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, if she saved more than $2,001, her SNAP benefits or food stamps would immediately decline. And she worried that that would actually leave her worse off in the long term. Tony felt utterly trapped. I watched as Tony calculated her hours, earnings, the cost of transportation, the cost of childcare to work, all of this while thinking about the offset in public benefits. Tony was a master of her own situation. Tony didn't need financial coaching, budgeting literacy, financial literacy. What she really needed was more cash. I met lots of people like Tony during the course of my work, and there are many people like Tony across the country. We know that 61% of Americans can't afford a $400 unexpected expense. We know that 1 in 5 Americans don't make enough to live above the poverty line. We know that these statistics are worse in communities of color, particularly Black communities, where 1 in 7 African Americans lives in poverty in one of the wealthiest country in the world. And over the past 40 years, as the wealthy of the rich has gone up, many of us have not seen an increase in wages while the cost of living continues to rise. So why is it that this pervasive economic inequality exists? What is the root cause of why this exists? Many of our policies to date would seek to remedy these problems by changing individuals' behaviors, helping individuals budget better, save more, maybe even find a new job. There's nothing necessarily wrong with those things. But that does not attack the absolute root cause of economic insecurity, and that is structural issues. Furthermore, I'd argue that some of these behavior change approaches actually reinforce this myth of individualism and this idea that the fallacy that just hard work alone is what equates to success. We know that it is not hard work alone. In fact, it's the way the opportunities are structured within our economy. And when we look too much and emphasize too much on behavior change, what ends up happening is when people don't succeed, they're blamed for their circumstance. It's your fault, work harder. It's your fault, work harder, over and over. I wonder what that does to a person and to communities over generations and lifetimes, when Black and brown folks for lifetimes have been told your economic situation is the result of your own making and choices. It's your fault, work harder. The truth is, freedom and opportunity are missed if choices are deprived and if opportunity structures are closed off. So how do we change the fundamental opportunity structures and what we believe about the causes of economic insecurity? So I'm here today to talk about guaranteed income, not as a single policy approach, but a complete paradigm shift on what we think we know about economic insecurity and what approaches are most appropriate. Guaranteed income is an approach to not only provide economic stability in the short term, but for us to think about our most ingrained beliefs about race, class, and deservedness and begin to question and uproot them. I began this work, as I mentioned, in the Old Fourth Ward, which is just blocks from here. We're in the Poncey Highland neighborhood, for those of you who haven't been here, but just blocks from here is the Old Fourth Ward. It's one of the most iconic and historic neighborhoods in probably Atlanta. And some features about this neighborhood: it's home to Edgewood Avenue, it's home to the King Center, it's where Dr. Martin Luther King was born and raised, it's very close to Ponce City Market, a very popular area of the Beltline is here. Lots of amazing history, lots of amazing things happening in this particular area. But it is also home to the largest concentration of Section 8 housing in the Southeast, juxtaposed with $1 million newly constructed homes. What we've seen is that the prosperity that is in the neighborhood has not been equally shared among its residents. So, for example, in 2000, the neighborhood was predominantly African American and the median household income was about $20,000 a year. By 2018, as the share of Black residents steeply declined, the median household income went up 2.5 times. Today in the Old Fourth Ward, despite this prosperity and the top-level statistics about the higher median income, nearly half of the Black residents in the Old Fourth Ward make less than $25,000 a year. And they live next to $1 million newly constructed homes. They live next to Ponce City Market with its Lux shopping center, the Beltline where you get $15 drinks. Right? Something is wrong here. But these trends in the Old Fourth Ward are not necessarily, while they're particularly pronounced there, they're not necessarily distinct. We know that they're happening in many places. 1 out of 3 of every Black residents in Atlanta live in poverty. We've seen incredible growth in the city. Why isn't this being shared? Sorry. And so we have to ask, what are the solutions that can help lead us to a better future? And I believe in that same neighborhood I just described, one of its most famous residents can help lead us to some of those solutions. And that's, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was born there, he pastored Ebenezer Baptist Church, and obviously a fierce advocate of racial and economic justice. Guaranteed income is, at its root, says the current approaches that we have are piecemeal, pygmy, and indirect. Each seeks to solve poverty by solving something else first. What if we just tried to solve poverty directly? King once said, "I'm now convinced the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by now a widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income." So what do I mean by guaranteed income? By guaranteed income, I mean regular cash payments accessible to members of a community with no strings attached and no work requirements. And we'll get to why all of these features in just a second. It is meant to supplement, not supplant, the existing social safety net, and is different than a universal basic income, meaning that it doesn't go to necessarily everyone, but it is targeted to those in the most need. We'll get to why that as well. And we know it works. Guaranteed income helps to improve health outcomes, educational outcomes, economic outcomes, all while reducing child poverty. There have been over 300 studies on cash transfers globally. We know that it has ripple effects across communities in incredible ways. We know that not just cash support as a one-time support, but guaranteed income, which is more long-term, can affect some of these outcomes in the long term as well. Guaranteed income functions as income stabilization, creating an income floor that no one can fall below and becomes a springboard to greater opportunity. In a survey of Old Fourth Ward residents, in my time working with the community, we surveyed over 500 residents and asked them about their hopes, their ambitions, but also one of the most foundational indicators of financial insecurity, how often you have to worry about your finances. What we found is that Black residents were 3 times more likely to worry about their finances. Why? Because Black residents were more likely to be experiencing financial strain. So I want us to think not just about the function that cash has as money in our pockets, but the way cash affects literally how we are able to operate in the world, how it feels not just for ourselves, but our families and for our communities, in the communities that have been shortchanged the most for the longest. Cash matters. It matters on a most foundational level. I want you to think of a time when you were short on cash, where you couldn't pay for something. Think about how it felt. Think about the anxiety that it provoked. Now imagine living with that feeling for days, months, years. We know that financial strain actually causes cognitive strain. So Princeton professor Eldar Shafir has studied what we call cognitive bandwidth. This is the idea that we only have but so much cognitive bandwidth, and when we're expending lots of energy thinking about where our next meal is going to come from, how we will pay our rent, how we will cover our basic material needs that affect the duration and quality of our life, we have less cognitive bandwidth to make some of these longer-term choices. Now, I'm not saying that people experiencing financial strain or poverty make bad choices. In fact, they make really good choices given the circumstances that they're in. What I'm saying is it is literally a heavy mental load living in poverty. So if we know cash works, and we know that it makes a big difference for not only for individuals but communities, why don't we already have cash policies in our social safety net? Why do all of our approaches seem to try to remedy individual behavior over systems change? Why do we emphasize that individuals should change how they approach the economy versus changing how the economy approaches individuals? Well, you may not be surprised to hear this, but race and racism play a foundational role in why cash is no longer part of our social safety net in approaches to economic security. The inception of the modern social safety net started in the early 20th century in an economic crisis not too different from the one that we're in now, the Great Depression. Coming out of the Great Depression, we had a suite of new policies providing baseline economic security for some Americans, not all, and these policies both either implicitly or explicitly excluded people of color. For example, the 1935 Social Security Act left out agricultural and domestic workers from receiving unemployment benefits. Well, agriculture and domestic workers were mostly people of color, mostly black at the time. As a result, 65% of black workers were unable to access unemployment insurance. Again, unemployment insurance is basically a cash policy. We can think about some of the corollaries today in some of the debate and conversation on the additional unemployment benefits and some of those being withheld. A lot of this continues to track. Another example was the Mother's Pension Program, which was a state-administered program and excluded nearly all black women from the program, despite the fact they're at least as likely to need that support as white women. The Mother's Pension Program was intended to keep mothers and kids out of the poorhouse, but 96% of the recipients were white women. The implied understanding was that black women should be in the labor force, no matter how low the wages or how hard the work. And these ideas track into today. We can see them into the 1980s as Ronald Reagan perpetuates the myth of the welfare queen, the idea that the stereotype of the lazy black woman living off of the state, and then we see them into the 1990s with the Clinton administration adding work requirements, changing welfare as we know it, insinuating that those who needed state assistance, those who are experiencing financial insecurity, are there because of their own making, because they are lazy. We know on some level these things are not true, but these beliefs are encoded in our policies. And if we want to change these beliefs, we need to change our policies. This is not just a vestige even from 20 years ago in the late 1990s, it tracks into today. So there is a program, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, called TANF. TANF provides cash assistance to those experiencing pretty extreme financial insecurity. To qualify for TANF in the state of Georgia, you need to make less than $783 a month, so that is incredibly low. Needless to say, the amount of TANF support does not meet the need for economic insecurity. But what we've seen is that investment in cash assistance has declined greatly over time. So that blue bar in 1997, TANF programs were providing mostly cash assistance and only a few sort of other activities. And what we've seen is that TANF has, over time, provided much less cash assistance. And of course, this is not equally distributed. States with higher white populations tend to give more direct assistance. States with higher black populations tend to give much less cash assistance. In fact, states with higher black populations tend to have more restrictive, punitive, exclusive social safety nets that are less generous in both the amount of benefits people are given, but also the duration people are given those benefits. 56% of black folks in America live in a state with the least generous benefits. Conversely, white folks live in states with the most generous benefits. So these track into today. Our policies drive our beliefs about who is deserving of help, and what kind of help. Is it that we help them directly, or do we make them jump through hoops over and over to prove their deservedness, to prove that this situation is not of their own making, despite how we know the economy is structured? So if we want to change minds and we want to have a paradigm shift, we have to begin by changing policy. This is what Ibram X. Kendi, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, and many other scholars have written about. Actually, our policies drive mindsets. Once we have a policy that perpetuates a disparity, our minds work to justify that disparity. And so guaranteed income, if done correctly, and it would have to be done correctly, has the power to flip this script. We can flip the script on some of these ideas of deservedness, who deserves help and who has to prove and reprove that they're deserving of that help. There are three characteristics about guaranteed income that help to get us there. It's direct, unconditional, and guaranteed. Let's talk about the directness first. What I mean by direct is it is direct financial assistance. There is really no substitute for cash. And so by giving people direct cash, they're able to best meet their own needs. It demonstrates that we trust them. Remember Toni, she is the expert on her life. She is the best person to think about, what do I need and how do I get there? It fundamentally believes that we trust other humans. When they tell us they have a problem and they know how to solve it, we trust them to do that. It's unconditional. By unconditional, I mean no work requirements. That is to say that the programs of the past have had this failing of that they continue to have people prove and reprove how deserving they are of that assistance. What if we believed in all humanity was deserving of a decent and dignified life? And lastly, it's guaranteed. That is to say that it is recurring. It's something that can be depended upon, and it provides an income floor that is actually reliable. And I think that these characteristics are not just related to how we view other people, but how we view humanity as a whole. What do we view and believe about humanity as a whole? So if we know guaranteed income works, and we know that, and we know why it isn't occurring, how do we start the path to get there? And who should we start with in this process? Well, during the course of my work with the Old Fourth Ward Economic Security Task Force, which was convened by Atlanta City Council member Amir Faroqi, we thought about not only how pervasive economic insecurity is, but where it is being felt most acutely. And although we began this process about 1.5 years ago, of course, a little over a year ago is when the pandemic and the economic fallout from it really set in. And we saw trends that were already in existence truly being amplified, particularly as it related to women across the board and communities of color. And then, of course, women of color who sit at that intersection. And so when we looked at the data, looked at what was happening, we found, not just myself, but this coalition of organizations and talking to community members, Black women were experiencing particularly acute financial strain, and particularly had been historically excluded, all of that data I just talked about, from so many of these social safety net programs. We find that black women face a 90% wealth gap compared to their white male counterparts. And I actually want this to sit in. For many of us, those are our sisters, our moms, our grandma, our great-grandma. It's had our aunts. It's had ripple effects, not just in our own lives, but across our entire community. Imagine each and every individual person, Black woman, experiencing a 90% wealth gap, and what that does actually to entire communities. We don't just function as individuals. And when we look at this 90% wealth gap, we know that 2/3 of that wealth is driven by lower earnings. and that this actually gets wider as educational attainment increases. This is not a hard work problem. This is not a do more. This is not a bad choice. This is not your making bad choices problem. In Georgia, Black women make 59 cents on the dollar to their white male counterparts today. If we want to do something about this, we have to fundamentally change the paradigm. Tweaking on the margins will no longer do. And so it is fitting when we think about income support, income stabilization, that we begin by thinking about Black women. We center those who have been marginalized. The policy is designed around the needs of those who are most marginalized by the status quo. This coalition of 28 organizations has come together in coalition with community members to actually start a program. And so we're beginning with a program focused on Black women called the Georgia Resilience and Opportunity Fund, providing $800 a month for 2 years, no strings attached, to 1,000 women across Georgia, starting with the women in the Old Fourth Ward. Thank you. And when we say resilience and opportunity, we're not talking about individual resilience or individuals taking up more opportunities. We're talking about an economy that's more resilient. We're talking about an economy that fosters greater opportunity for everyone, not just those at the top. And so this Georgia Resilience or Opportunity Fund or GROW Fund, we believe can be a launch pad to think about what does this program look like on a bigger level, maybe reaching more people, maybe reaching more groups of people. And so this program will launch in the fall of 2020, this fall of 2021. And we're excited that it'll begin right here in the Old Fourth Ward, where not only where these problems are pronounced, but also where the solutions are. And so I'll raise the question again, like, what is the root cause of economic insecurity? Is it people or is it systems? And I think based on a lot of what we see, we know it's systems. But these broken systems, they do violence on people. I've used a lot of terms today like economic insecurity, financial precarity, poverty, being poor. All of those are euphemisms that disguise the brutal nature of economic insecurity that deprives both the duration, quality, and material well-being of other human beings. We have let it persist for much too long, and it does violence upon those people. I'm reminded of another quote from a king, Coretta Scott King, where she says, in this society, violence against poor people and minority groups is routine. I remind you that a starving child is violence. Neglecting school children is violence. Punishing a mother and her child is violence. Discrimination against the working man is violence. Ghetto housing is violence. Contempt of poverty is violence. Even the lack of willpower to help humanity is a sick and sinister form of violence. This is not just about the economic well-being of those people over there who experience these issues. This is about our humanity together, what we are willing to do for one another, how we are willing to share prosperity with one another, how we are willing to make different policy choices to yield different outcomes. The way things are is not the way they have to be. We could change some of those policies, we could change some of those regulations, but yet we continue to make these choices. And so what I'm asking is for a drastic paradigm shift in which we don't view people as other, but we view them as part of us. And I think that together we can create just a better overall system in which no person has to worry about their needs. No person has to worry about that basic economic security. And what would that mean? What type of society would we be? How would we be creative, innovative? What would we be capable of together if this was true? And we have the resources to do it. Thank you.
Our humanity together, truly powerful, powerful words.
Thank you.
So we learned with Dr. Erica just a few moments ago that language constructs so much of our world, right? And oftentimes not knowing terminology holds people back from having these conversations. And this is an important conversation to have. So I wanted to take a moment and see if you could help us understand the difference between UBI, Universal Basic Income, which became really popular during a presidential run, BI, Basic Income, and then Guaranteed Income, which you're talking about here.
Yeah, so sometimes some of these terms are a bit interchangeable, and it's one of the reasons I took a couple minutes to define guaranteed income. But generally, when we talk about universal basic income, we're talking about a set amount of money going to all members of a community, so the entire universe of that community. And so it typically goes to everyone despite sort of how high their earnings might be. And so for that reason, it's not as targeted in its approach to those most in need. So that's a universal basic income. A basic income typically describes an income that is high enough to meet your basic needs or to cover your basic needs. That's actually a little bit higher of a threshold than a guaranteed income. A guaranteed income is a set amount of cash that you can depend upon or rely upon that is guaranteed. It may be enough to meet one's basic needs, hopefully, but it is not always necessarily sufficient to meet your basic needs. So when we think about probably $800 a month, that the Grow Fund will provide, that is not a basic income, but it is a guaranteed amount of income.
Okay, that's important to know. And so with that, about 150 years ago during the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln said, of the people, by the people, for the people. We've spoken offline about always centering the people at our activism as well. How do you go about doing that here?
Yeah, I think a lot about, so many of our social policies are constructed by people who haven't experienced issues themselves and who are quite removed from communities. And how often do we actually think about the people who are experiencing the issue and listen to them when they tell us what they need? How often do we empower them to just get what they need, right? Not even having to tell us. And so I think if we want just and equitable policies, it begins not only by centering those on the margins, but when people tell us what they need, we have to believe them. And so throughout this process, we tried hard over the past year, and certainly more could have been done, but we tried pretty hard to ensure that not only with our community organizations, but we were in constant communication with folks who might be potential program participants. Everything from the duration of the program, so the 2 years, the $800 amount, there's also a lump sum component to the program. All of that was really driven by talking to people who would be participants in the program and really thinking about how do we actually center design around people who the system has not worked well for a really long time.
So you brought up an interesting point of believing the people, right? And guaranteed income, from what I'm understanding, no strings attached. What is it that causes us not to believe the people so often?
I think this is ingrained in the most fundamental aspects of sort of individualism and the myth of meritocracy in America, that hard work is sufficient to be successful. And what that implies is that those at the top deserve to be there because they've worked hard to be there. And those at the bottom deserve to be there because, well, they had choices too. I think this is something I said earlier, but freedom is a fallacy if choices are closed, if there are no good choices and opportunities are cut off. That's not actually true if an opportunity structure has been structured so much against you that very few people like you are able to make it. That is not actually using the 2 to 3% of people from your community who, quote, make it, is actually used often against other folks where we say, well, X, Y, Z, insert famous person's name there, was able to make it, so why can't you? That's actually a disciplining tactic from the status quo to get people to sort of fall in line and question their own sense of what they need.
Very interesting. So I want to end with a fairly difficult question and a two-parter. What is the loudest and most, kind of out there criticism of guaranteed income? And what would you say is the most valid criticism of guaranteed income?
Yeah. The loudest criticism of guaranteed income is certainly the cost of a program at scale. And so And I'll be transparent about that. So if we thought about at scale, let's say the one in 5 Americans who live in poverty, that's scale, literally millions of people. It is interesting though that, there are some programs, we look at the price tag and we say, too expensive. There are other programs that we don't say that. There are also some estimates that show childhood poverty costs us $1 trillion a year. Like, if we want to compare costs, I think that the cost of the program is one thing, sort of how it impacts economic forecasts going forward is another thing. But I also think apart from the fiscal cost, there's a cost to humanity. We live in one of the wealthiest countries. We live in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. There is nothing we can't do if we wanted. Again, the extreme inequality that we see and the poverty that prevails is the result of choices. Current programs don't have to be punitive, they don't have to be restrictive, they don't have to be exclusionary. They could function in different ways, and yet they function the way that they do in large part because as people of color, particularly Black folks, got access to these systems, we made them more closed off and we made them more punitive. And so all of this is to say that I think many folks, when it comes to not just guaranteed income, but investment in education, investment in a lot of different things that would have these positive ripple effects across communities and probably a disproportionate positive impact for Black and brown communities, a lot of folks immediately point to the price tag, but I think that's incredibly misguided and short-sighted. The second part of your question?
What do you think is the most valid actual criticism of it?
I think that any policy that is universal at scale will, in terms of racial disparities have been constructed specifically because policies have excluded by race or have had disparate impact by race. And so any policy at scale that is general it will be very difficult for us to close the racial wealth gap that we just talked about. So can it provide a baseline of economic security? Yes, and it does that. That certainly reflects our shared humanity, the fact that all of us deserve to have a decent, dignified life, but it actually isn't gonna do much to undo some of the harm, the violence that has been done, not just harm, but literal violence that has been done. So I would say that when we think about guaranteed income, I think about it in terms of a whole suite of reforms that we need to think about that actually are not just providing, like, guaranteed income to me is like the baseline, right? Sure. Like, people should be able to live decent, dignified lives where they don't feel a heavy burden around their material conditions in the wealthiest country in the world. Like, that is a baseline, and then how we sort of remove harm or attempt to, make amends for harm is a complete other story. So that might be one of the criticisms, but I think that's coming from the other direction, the other political direction that you might have been thinking of.
No, fair enough. Hope, thank you for sharing this with us, and thank you for the work that you are doing out there in the world today. Thank you. So I fell in love with the idea of TED Talks very early on, ideas worth sharing. And I often ask myself, what are ideas that are worth sharing? Is it ideas that make us richer, more compassionate, makes the world more sustainable, or ideas that make us better as human beings? And to me, those are the ideas that are worth sharing, ideas that move us, our community, our people in the world forward. And too often, as we grow up, we lose this sense of curiosity to ask about these ideas, to go out there and research and obtain more ideas. My alma mater, our motto is Cor Prudens Possidium Scientium. And while I may have butchered the Latin meaning, or the saying of it, what it means is the wise heart seeks knowledge. The wise heart seeks knowledge. Because these ideas that make us better are not just things that impact our brain, but our heart as well, and inspire curiosity to learn about health, and that this other pandemic is going to come whether we like it or not in our lifetime. And now is the time for us to act on it, to understand the unconscious biases that we have in our own brains when we look at our friends who are Black versus African American, and starting to become comfortable with that, to understand that $800 can change the life of a Black woman in Atlanta who may be your friend, neighbor, mother, or community member. And so I genuinely want to thank you all for coming today, for opening up your minds, and for reaching out and understanding and growing together as a community. So sincerely, thank you all so much for coming out. I also want to take a moment and thank our partners without who this would not be possible. I hope you will thank them on your way out as well. In a quick moment, if I can get the team of TEDx to stand up for Poncey Highland. They have done incredible work behind the scenes. And ideas worth sharing are nothing without action. So we've got 3 wonderful community partners outside who have tables. I hope you will go and engage with them, have conversations with them, and figure out how you can help your communities, whether it's with your time, energy, effort, or mental capacity. So thank you all once again so much for coming here. I hope you will take a moment and engage with our speakers. They're going to come out in a moment, and enjoy the rest of your evening and your weekend. Thank you all. You can come out.